You're watching This Week in Louisiana Politics with Fred Childers.
Good Sunday morning to you. I'm Fred Childers. Thanks for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics on your local election headquarters. Well, the midterm elections are less than 2 weeks away, but there's another race we're watching very closely. Next October, we will go to the polls to choose a governor. Governor John Bel Edwards has not made a formal announcement, but has said publicly he'll seek re-election. The only official challenger so far is Baton Rouge businessman Eddie Rispone. The unofficial list of possible challengers includes Republicans, Attorney General Jeff Landry, Congressman Ralph Abraham, State Senator Sharon Hewitt, and Senator John Kennedy. The election is October 12th in 2019. And speaking of the governor's race, U.S. Senator John Kennedy says he will put an end to the months and months of speculation on whether he'll run for governor. It's a frequently asked question of the Republican senator, as he often criticizes the performance of Governor John Bel Edwards, a Democrat. And an emailed statement from the John Kennedy campaign states that Kennedy will make his decision before December 1st. When asked the question as late as last Friday, Kennedy gave his typical response that he had not made a final decision. Now, the announcement included a poll by Survey USA and has Kennedy leading Edwards in a runoff election 48% to 39%. That race is less than a year away, but folks in Georgia will be headed to the polls in a few weeks to pick their governor. The state, historically a red one, has seen some shifting in partisan loyalty. According to JMC Analytics and polling, which partnered with Bold Blue campaigns, Democrats are making some inroads in the historically heavily Republican Atlanta suburbs, which could spell trouble for the Republican candidate Brian Kemp. A recently conducted poll shows a very tight race, with Kemp trailing his Democratic challenger. Stacey Abrams has 47%, Kemp has 46%, and 6% remain undecided. State leaders in charge of protecting Louisiana's coastline addressed the Press Club of Baton Rouge. That happened on Monday. Johnny Bradbury, chairman of Louisiana's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, talked to the crowd about the ongoing problem of land loss and the funding needed to properly combat the problem.
The next 20 years is crucial for us. We have a window of opportunity, and if we can act with large, impactful projects within that window, we can make a difference. Okay, we can not stop, but learn to adapt this freight train that's coming at us.
1.5 million Louisiana citizens live on the coast, which is half of the state's population. Several Baton Rouge officials came together on Wednesday to back a ballot proposal that would fund a mental health crisis stabilization center in Baton Rouge. According to event organizers, the tax proposal would raise $6 million a year for a decade for the center, but they add it would save the community some $55 million over the life of the tax.
Treating the patient appropriately, and that really is the crux of having the Bridge Center, is that we can have a crisis stabilization center for mental health patients that are appropriately triaged to that area and get the help they need. So the most important piece of all this is the patient.
Coroner Bo Clark was one of the several local leaders at the event. Coming up next, last Tuesday was the first day of early voting. The numbers of voters who turned out from that day are worth a discussion. We're talking to pollster John Couvion. That's next on your local election headquarters.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back to This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm joined by John Couvion with JMC Analytics and Polling. And John, we're taking a look at the early numbers, and you've already poured through those numbers. And at the beginning of your research, you wrote something that struck me, which was only 2 times have examining the first day's early voting been a real eye-opener. Number one you listed was the 2016 presidential election. We know what happened there. And number 2, you said last Tuesday's early voting numbers.
Yes.
What was so significant about them?
The interesting thing about it is when looking at the early voting volume of the first day, to put things in proper context, 87,000 people early voted the first day of the presidential election, 69,000 did last night. And to put this in even further context, that's 3 times the first day early voting that occurred in the 2016 Senate runoff. So for a supposedly boring election cycle, the fact that you had that big of a spike really caught my attention, and therefore that's what I referred to in my blog.
Right, and you had listed in 2008 when early voting became available, 34,498 turned out. 2012, 54,989 turned out. 2016, 87,000, as you just mentioned.
Yes.
Tuesday's numbers was 69,000, which is technically it's fewer than the 2016, but there was a different election going on there.
It is. You have to keep it in, you have to put it in proper perspective, which is for 2016, we're talking about a presidential election. That is going to be the highest turnout kind of election that you could ever have. So think of that as a pinnacle from which you cannot exceed. So given that you had a presidential election with that many people early voting, the fact that we got within 80% of that on the first day, I thought was pretty impressive in itself.
Does this early voting increase translate to higher voter turnout in general?
It can, but you have to put it in proper perspective. In other words, you have to consider what the first day early voting was in other elections held over the last decade, ever since Louisiana has instituted in-person early voting. What it does say to me, though, is all these prognosticators who supposedly thought that this was going to be a boring election where nobody was interested, well, obviously they've been proven wrong, because 69,000 people showing up to vote for quote-unquote boring congressional and/or school board races, that definitely catches my attention, particularly when you consider that's 3 times the number of early voters who went to pick a United States senator in 2016.
Yeah. Let's get a little deeper into that. What do you think is driving that?
What I think is happening is this. There's 2 things I would attribute it to. Number one is that people are seeing reports of heightened early voting across the country and long lines, and I think that they're thinking, oh, now there's an election, I need to go vote because all these people across the nation are voting. The second thing that I think is occurring is this. Democrats have had a heightened advantage in enthusiasm ever since about a year ago. Ever since the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, I'm seeing heightened interest from conservatives, which in a conservative state like Louisiana means you're going to have elevated Republican turnout. In fact, what I saw when I looked at the partisan and the racial breakdown of those who early voted yesterday, it was positively mediocre for the Democrats and for the blacks. That's something they need to be concerned about, because their voters did not show up here in Louisiana relative to other elections I've seen.
And it's not likely they'll show up on Election Day on November 6th?
It's less likely, because basically what I've seen is the first day of early voting tends to set the context for the entire election season. You can kind of get some clues as to what will happen on that, based on that first day, kind of like what happened in 2008 when, with Barack Obama and Mary Landrieu on the ballot, Democratic early voting went to levels that I had never seen before in my life.
So it doesn't necessarily translate into higher voter turnout, but it is nice to see that there is some enthusiasm, especially on the front end of the election cycle.
Right. What I think it means is this. My consistent predictions about a 30% turnout, right now from the numbers I saw last night, 30% is actually on the pessimistic side. At the present time, I think that you could look at a 30 to 35% turnout, which, considering that you don't have a statewide election other than the Secretary of State's office on the ballot, that's pretty impressive for a midterm here in Louisiana.
And it's not bad when you compare it to the last election we saw. I think it dipped down into the single digits, or at least close to it, right?
The low teens for the treasurer's race last fall, yes. Because the only thing you had competing with that for attention was the mayor's race in New Orleans and a couple of other scattered races around the state. Now you do have school board races, you have some state representative races, parish presidents, basically a smorgasbord of various races in addition to the 6 congressional races. So there is a certain level of interest that I think is heightened by the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And in other words, you're going to have a respectable turnout this year.
Absolutely. Well, it's certainly interesting data. And again, early voting goes from October 23rd to October 30th.
Yes, Tuesday to Tuesday.
Yeah, Tuesday to Tuesday. So, all right, great information. Thank you, John.
Always a pleasure.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more This Week in Louisiana Politics.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. A Louisiana senator and the president are focusing on immigration as one of the main issues in the upcoming midterm election. Washington correspondent Drew Petrimo reports the president is threatening to use the military to stop thousands of migrants walking north through Mexico toward the U.S. border.
The images are stunning. A procession of thousands walking north through sweltering Mexican heat. On Monday night, during a rally in Houston, President Trump called the migrant caravan an assault on the country.
You have some very bad people, and we can't let that happen to our country.
The president is promising to block the migrants from entering the U.S., even if it means using the military. And just 2 weeks from the midterm elections, Republicans are making the issue a central theme in their effort to maintain control of Congress. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy.
I agree with the president. We must be able to control our borders. Folks should not be able to come in here illegally and gain harbor.
The campaign of Marsha Blackburn, a Republican Senate candidate in Tennessee, called the migrants an illegal alien mob while blasting her opponent as soft on immigration. But Jennifer Quigley with Human Rights First says stories being told about the migrants are misleading.
Normally what we see in these caravans is that you have people fleeing both violence and persecution.
And Quigley says those who do make it to the U.S. border face intense scrutiny.
You're going to be seen by an asylum officer, by an immigration court judge. You're going to have all of the security background checks done.
Democrats are largely staying away from the immigration issue in the final weeks of the campaign. But in the Tennessee Senate race, the campaign for Democratic candidate Phil Bredesen said Blackburn's attacks amounted to disgusting fear-mongering. In Washington, I'm Drew Petrimo.
Now, at last check, the caravan is estimated to be about 7,500 people. Human Rights First says that will likely be greatly reduced during the long trek across Mexico. A bill pushed by Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy has been signed into law. Washington correspondent Drew Petrimo reports the bipartisan legislation includes an array of provisions to increase opioid treatment options, spur new research, and block illegal drugs at the border.
Joined by the First Lady and Republican lawmakers, President Trump put ink to paper, signing a far-reaching law aimed at fighting opioid addiction.
We are going to end it, or we are going to at least make an extremely big dent in this terrible, terrible problem.
The Support for Patients and Communities Act contains the input of more than a dozen House and Senate committees and scores of lawmakers. Tennessee Senator Lamar Alexander pushed to expand research into non-addictive pain medication at the National Institutes of Health.
Non-addictive treatments for pain is the holy grail of the opioid epidemic.
The law also aims to make it easier for law enforcement to intercept illegal drug shipments coming in from overseas and seeks to tighten restrictions on opioid prescriptions. Arkansas Attorney General Leslie Rutledge attended the signing. She supports the bill's efforts to increase treatment options for addicts.
We have so many people in Arkansas that are in need of the treatment programs to make those more available, more accessible to Arkansans and their families who are battling these addictions.
Drug overdoses killed 72,000 people in the U.S. last year. 2/3 involved opioids, up dramatically from the year before. But a study released this week shows overdose deaths may have leveled off in the first part of this year. The hope is the new law builds on that progress, helping to save thousands of lives. In Washington, I'm Drew Petrimo.
And the president calls the legislation the single largest bill to combat the drug crisis in the history of the country. He's confident it will make a big difference. Well, first came the robocalls, but now political campaigns around the country are sending campaign texts to cell phones, if they have your number, that is. Eric Wilson is a digital strategist based in Washington, D.C. He hasn't been registered to vote in Texas for a decade, but still gets personalized texts from the Beto O'Rourke Texas Senate campaign asking for his vote. While most of us read them and hit delete, a Texas man is suing the O'Rourke campaign, demanding $500 per unwanted text message.
Certainly annoying, but illegal it's not. We all have cell phones and we all get text messages, so it's the best way to reach everyone.
The lawsuit claims the texts violate the 1991 Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which is in place, but the political campaigns say as long as the texts are being physically dialed by an individual, the messages are completely legal. Up next, we'll have a look at the week ahead on your local election headquarters.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. State politics is often full of life when it comes to the afterlife. Capitol correspondent Harrison Golden tours the old state capitol where spirits are high.
If there ever was a place where spirits would linger, it would be here at the old state capitol. I mean, it's a beautiful building. Who would want to leave?
Rumor has it that some political heavyweights of Louisiana's past haven't left the old capitol. Just ask museum director Mary DeRusso.
You hear doors slam, motion detectors that go off, noises that you can't explain, and I believe every one of them.
Though she says there's a line between history and hype, take the death of State Senator Pierre Couvillon in 1852.
The rumor is that he died right here in this room, that he was so angered by a legislative debate that he died from a heart attack.
The senator from Avoyelles Parish actually died in his bed, but DeRusso wonders if he commutes back to Baton Rouge every once in a while.
If he still roams the halls here, it's just because he felt like he had unfinished business and he didn't want to leave.
Other spirits may be trapped inside, as another story goes. Indeed, during the Civil War, political prisoners were jailed in the basement.
So is it likely that somebody might have passed away there? Entirely possible.
Finally, the story of former Governor Henry Allen, who fled Louisiana after the Civil War and died in Mexico. Friends moved his body to New Orleans and eventually to a plot just beside one of the trees he planted.
I hope he's very happy here.
DeRusso admits she has questions about whether the spirits actually haunt the old grounds, but either way, she says the history all around speaks to her.
And I like to think of the spirit of this building as the great spirit of democracy.
At Louisiana's old state capitol, for your local election headquarters, I'm Harrison Golden.
Great story. It's a fascinating place. You should go check it out when you have time. This past Thursday, the old state capitol hosted the 3rd annual Spirits of Louisiana in what is admittedly a play on words. The event featured other kinds of spirits, cocktails crafted by distilleries all across the state. Well, This Week in Louisiana Politics is all about giving you a preview of what you can expect in the coming week. Taking a look at the schedule this week, just a quick reminder, early voting ends on Tuesday, but don't go try to vote today. Polls are closed on Sunday. The Secretary of State's office recommends that you take advantage of early voting because many of you are working on Election Day, which is next Tuesday on November 6th. And for all of the election information that you need, just head to brproud.com. Again, polls are closed today, but you still have Monday and Tuesday to get your votes in. All right, thank you for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm Fred Childers. I'll see you next Sunday right here on your local election headquarters.